forward as you like. And the closer in you get, the easier it's going to be to see. And we're going to start you off with King Robert as the Scots understood it.
Around the year 1290, a series of unfortunate deaths left Scotland in dire need of a rightful heir, a king. King Edward I of England was asked to step in to judge the claims to the throne. But King Edward's intentions were not all they seemed, and Edward invaded Scotland, ruling it as an English province. In 1302, a Scottish aristocrat by the name of Robert Bruce, who had pledged allegiance to Edward, married 13-year-old Elizabeth de Burgh in Essex. Robert held a claim to the Scottish throne, as did his bitter rival John Comyn. But while Bruce now chose to give his allegiance to Edward I, Comyn led Scottish resistance to the English king. In 1306, Robert Bruce agreed to meet John Comyn at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. Tempers flared, and Robert stabbed his rival, leaving his henchman to finish the job. Outlawed by Edward and excommunicated by the Pope, Robert Bruce defiantly took the throne at Scone. Who was supporting Robert Bruce? People like me, James Douglas. I needed to get my lands back. Others loathed English taxes or wanted a Scot on our ancient throne. But many in Scotland hated Bruce for killing Comyn and taking Baliol's crown. They fought with Edward to catch this jumped-up murderer. In those days, even I didn't believe this so-called king could get my lands back for me. King Edward's men defeated Robert's army, killed his brother, captured his queen, his sisters, and his daughters. Robert Bruce sought refuge in remote islands, where he regained his conviction to fight. Sometime later, he heard of the death of Edward, and over the next 6 years ran a campaign to gain the support of his countrymen and women, which he accomplished. But his queen, the only one capable of giving him a natural heir, was still imprisoned in England. Robert regained control of most of Scotland, capturing English strongholds one after another, but had yet to take Stirling Castle. Robert's forces lay siege to it. Eventually, the commander-in-charge agreed to hand over control of the castle if it were not reached by the English army by Midsummer's Day, 1314. So the English, led by Edward II, marched north to fight.
By a French princess. Her name is Isabella. She is the wife of Edward II. She's therefore also the Queen of England. Now she is princess folk. She's going to take her time joining us. That's why we're staring at this black screen for a wee while. However, she is worth the wait. Not only will she tell you quite a bit about what goes on in England in the years before 1314, she'll also play an important role in England in the years after. So you'll hear more about her in our final film as well. Here she is, though, now to give you the English side of things.
Edward was a strong King of England. In 1291, he supported John Baliol's claim to be King of Scotland. However, in 1296, he sought to tighten his grip on Scotland by removing John Baliol and taking power himself. At times, it looked like he had succeeded, but several years later, a formerly loyal aristocrat, Robert Bruce, defied King Edward and had himself crowned King of Scotland. Edward's army marched north to crush the rebellion. But on the way, King Edward fell ill and died. The crown of England fell to his son. Along with his father's crown, Edward of Carmarthen inherited the responsibility to deal with the Scottish rebellion and his father's substantial debts. My lords and ladies, I am Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip the Fair of France, and I was betrothed to this man, Edward of Carmarthen, when I was 8 years old. With the full approval of two very powerful royal households, in 1308, I took Edward of Carmarthen to be my husband. There was great pomp and ceremony. Within weeks, we were crowned King and Queen of England. A less than perfect affair, due in no small part to the presence of one Piers Gaveston. Before the coronation festivities were over, it became clear to me that I was not the king's favourite. He preferred the company of his long-term friend, Piers Gaveston, a man much hated by the barons of England, for he was given power, land, and income that he did not deserve. And soon they could bear it no more. The barons hunted him down and murdered him. And for a while, Edward turned his attention back to England and to me. But the rebellion in Scotland, led by Robert Bruce, is all but complete. And now England has no choice. It must form an army, and it must reach Stirling Castle before Midsummer's Day, or the garrison there will kneel before the Scots.
Next, we're going to take you through into the battle room. Not quite as intimidating as it sounds, we just call it that because that's where I'm going to talk you through the battle. To get there, we're going to have to cross our main exhibition space. You'll see loads of exciting stuff in the main exhibition space, arms and armour on display, images projected all around the room. I promise you will get to explore in here. Not missing out on anything by following me into the battle room now. We are going to head into the battle room first, just so you get to find out what actually happened here in June 1314. Just this way. So we're going to head up this corridor behind me where the red light is. No steps and no stairs anywhere in the exhibition. Don't need to worry about that. However, as we turn the corner, we're going to go up a little ramp. And it's easy to miss where the ramp starts and the low light, so just mind your step as we go. Not like 1314, we pride ourselves on getting everybody out that we got in. And that's the map. Most of the actions that I have towards the south end of our map, so come as far around as you can for me. Basically, the further around you come, the easier it should be to see everything that's going on. Perfect there, folks. I'm going to disappear around the corner and reappear through the doors, just so you don't have to watch me climb through the railing, but I'll be back. To the battle room. That there in front of you, that's our battle map. That is as close a recreation of the area as it would have looked in 1314 as we can get. This is where I'm going to talk you through the battle. Now it is going to take 10, maybe 15 minutes to do this. So, first question I want to ask is, will you be alright standing or leaning against that railing for 10, 15 minutes? Or would anybody like me to pass them a seat? Fine. All good? Fine. Yep. If you change your mind as we go, folks, you can just ask. Same goes if you've got any questions about anything I'm telling you down here. I don't mind interruptions. I would rather focus in on the bits that interest you or explain anything that you thought I hadn't explained very well, rather than have you just kind of stand there in the darkness and me with it on. Right. The first feature that I want to introduce you to is Stirling Castle. It's almost exactly 2 miles to the north of us. North is that way, both on the map and in real life. And in June 1314, Stirling's in English hands. You'll remember that from our introductory film. An English army, 18 to 20,000 of them, is heading up this old Roman road from Falkirk, hoping to relieve the castle, hoping to rescue the garrison there. To do that, though, they're going to have to get across the Pell stream in the middle of our map, the bannockburn down here in the south, and an army of about 5,000 to 7,000 Scots, pretty much where we are. This area, where the visitor centre now sits, this was known in 1314 as the New Park, a hunting park designed to serve as Stirling Castle. It's here on the 22nd of June, so actually the day before the fighting starts, that Bruce parks his army blocking that road. Now the first advantage Bruce has at Bannockburn is that he's known the English were coming for about a month. So although he only comes here on the 22nd, for a month or so before that, he's been down here off the south end of our map in an area known as the Torwood, training his men and planning for what to do with them when the English arrive. When he pulls his army out of the Tor Wood and into the new park on the 22nd, he also has his men dig honeycombed pits filled with sharpened stakes on either side of the old Roman road, just north of Milton Ford. Milton Ford's down here. It's the main crossing point on the Bannockburn in 1314. That means when Edward arrives down here at about 3 in the afternoon on the 23rd of June, obviously the army has to thin down into a column anyway, just to fit across the ford. But then once they're across the ford, folks, they can't spread back out and overwhelm the Scots. That's what they'd like to do. Instead, they can only hit the Scots head on, just on a little narrow front. Still in their column. Now that suits the Scots. The Scots are outnumbered 2, maybe 3 to 1. Doesn't actually matter though if the English can only attack a few guys at a time. The English are driven back across the burn. Same thing happens to some English cavalry sent around the Scots to attack them up the road at St Ninians. They too are driven off. And that's it for the first day. 2 short skirmishes, both go the way of the Scots. That leaves Edward still down here, now by about 5, maybe 6 in the evening, facing a seemingly simple, but actually quite treacherous choice. Left or right. Edward needs to get past the traps if he wants to bring his numbers to bear against the Scots. He can only do that by going left into the west, or right into the east. And actually, if he tries to go west, he's got Milton Bog, Halbert's Bog, and Gillies Hill to worry about. All of the land to the west of us is going to slow Edward down, and then Bruce will just run away. Bruce, folks, is a guerrilla leader. Doesn't need this battle, not the way Edward does. Bruce can escape. Disappear off into the northwest. Maybe go and hide in the Lennox. That's where he went and hid the last time Edward came north. That was back in 1310. If Bruce does that again in 1314, that'll be twice now that Edward's come north, spoiling for a fight, and Bruce has made him look a fool. Edward couldn't afford that in 1310, never mind 1314, so instead he goes east. He travels along the relatively high ground here, till he reaches about that point. And I know it's a bit hard to tell, folks, on our map, but there is a ridge that runs along that line there. Everything east of that ridge, everything this side of the ridge, in 1314, is known as the Carse of Stirling. Carse is an old Scots word, folks. It applies to any wide, flat, fertile plain around a river. In this case, the River Forth. And there are areas of wetland down there too, particularly clustered around the streams. The streams, you see, they deposit on their banks this fine-grained material. It's called alluvial clay. The water from the streams keeps that clay wet. Keeps it soft and malleable. Mostly, though, the Carse is just meadowlands, used for grazing sheep in peacetime. Bits of it are even used for growing crops. So it's fairly flat, fairly dry. Certainly it's flat enough and dry enough that Edward can get his horses and his carts, and his men, across the Bannockburn down there, and they camp overnight in that narrow space between the Bannockburn, the Pell Stream Burn, and Balquiderick Ridge, that roughly triangular area. And that sounds like a good idea. Down there they've got access to the fresh water of the 2 streams, vital of course for refreshing men and horses who, remember, have come 13 miles from Falkirk on the first day of battle. During the night, those streams will protect the flanks of Edward's army, the sides of the army. And if Bruce does on day 2 what he did on day 1, nothing. Remember, just hold this ground where we are now. From the Carse, Edward can do as he pleases. He can attack the Scots from the east. It's quite a gentle slope at Balquiderick Ridge, that's why it doesn't show up very well on the map. He can cross the 2 streams in the north, form up in that sort of area, cutting Bruce off from his escape route into the northwest. So although nothing's gone right for the English on the first day, there's probably a feeling in the English camp overnight that Bruce has played his trick. When in fact Bruce now has Edward exactly where he wants him. At the crack of dawn on the 24th of June, maybe as early as 4 in the morning. Bruce leads his army out of the new park, where we are, down to Balquiderick Ridge, that's where Bannockburn High School is nowadays, and then they advance down from the ridge, down into the Carse, where the English have spent the night. And hopefully you can see the problem here immediately for the English. They're trapped. Streams on 3 sides of them, Scots on the other. The Scots are all on foot. They're wearing light armour, mostly padding, and they are carrying long spears, spears 13, maybe 14 feet long. The English call these formations schiltrons. Another old Scots word for you there, like cars. Schiltron in Scots really just means a big group of guys. Not clear the Scots use that term to describe themselves. Actually, the only Scots source to describe anything at Bannockburn as a schiltron uses the word only to describe the big, confused mass of Englishmen trapped between the two streams. That same source, which describes the English as a schiltron, describes the Scottish formations as looking like an urchin. Urchin, if you can believe it, is an old Scots word that means hedgehog. But whatever we call them, they've got the English trapped. That's the important thing. The English try to fight their way out. They get their armour on, those that haven't just been sleeping in their armour anyway. The wealthier men in the army then get on their horses, and they charge head first into the Scottish spearmen. And of course they can't get through. A lot of the horses probably won't even charge at this bristling wall of spears that now faces them. Now at that point, the English would like to pull their cavalry back and get their infantry, especially their archers, forward. You can imagine, right, a bristling wall of spears. Well, that may frighten the horses, fair enough. To an archer, though, it's just a big, easy target. Bruce, though, has yet another trick up his sleeve. Because remember, he's been training his men down here in the Torwood for a month ahead of our battle. And what he's been training them to do is to move forward in formation. So as soon as the English cavalry tries to pull back, the spearmen just advance forward and gobble up all that space. And then that keeps happening. The English keep trying to pull back, regroup, reform, redeploy. Scots just keep coming though, squeezing the English into an ever tighter space between the two streams. Soon even King Robert joins the fight. He'd stayed at the back initially so he could watch what was happening, react if anything went wrong. When he sees the English are starting to crack though, he leads his reserve down from the ridge down to get stuck into the action. By now, King Edward or the men around him, they can see the jig's up. They know they've lost. So King Edward flees or perhaps is dragged north towards the castle. And when the English see the king's banner leaving the field, king's banner would have been a flag with his coat of arms on, so that pattern there for Edward, 3 gold lions, leopards they're sometimes called in heraldic terms, on a red field. Soon as the English see the king's banner vanishing northwards, they too realise they've lost. Now the whole army starts to break apart and flee. Some of them flee north with the king. Most of them, though, flee south, back the way they'd come, back across the Bannockburn. And that's where their trouble starts. Because by now the wetlands on either side of the burn, remember the thick, cloying alluvial clay, the wetlands have had 20,000 pairs of English feet through them. Never mind the hooves of maybe 9,000 horses and the wheels of hundreds, maybe thousands of carts and wagons as well. All churning the wetlands into a quagmire, into a muddy mess. Do you imagine that if anybody slips or falls in the mud and the water, that the guys behind them let them get back up? By the end of the day, there are so many drowned and trampled down there, the Scots reckoned you could walk from one side of the burn to the other without even getting your feet wet. Going back to the dead bodies. Edward does make it up there to Stirling Castle. When he gets there, though, the garrison tell him to beat it because they can see the Scots have won. They're going to surrender once the fighting is over. If Edward is in that castle, when it's surrendered, he becomes Bruce's prisoner. The only way he'll see freedom after that is by recognising Bruce as the rightful king. That would mean ending the war. Edward doesn't fancy that. So instead, he flees around the King's Park, where the golf club is these days, down the western side of our map, off the south end, all the way to Dunbar. That's nearly 70 miles in that direction. From Dunbar, Edward takes a ship for England and for safety. And he takes the long way around because by now he's being chased by that lad you met in our introductory film. Remember the Black Douglas? Or the good Sir James, depending on your point of view. Then, in November 1314, Bruce is back here, Cambus Kenneth Abbey. He holds a parliament there where he declares if you want to hold land in Scotland, you've got to recognise him as the rightful king first. If you refuse, he'll take your lands away, dish them out however he fancies. We mention that because it's probably the best single event to help you to understand why Bannockburn is so important. Because Bannockburn doesn't end the war. 14 more years worth of fighting after Bannockburn. Even then, a year after the English finally do accept a peace deal, Bruce dies. 4 years after that, the English invade again. Peace between England and Scotland remains elusive all through the 14th century, through most of the 15th century, and through quite a handsome chunk of the 16th century too. So what's the point? You know, if Bannockburn doesn't end the war, why should anybody care? Well, Bannockburn allows Robert to start carving the kingdom up among his most faithful supporters, and more importantly, allows him to start rebuilding the Scottish political community around himself. That means when the English do invade again, there are always families out there, the Douglases, the Stuarts, the Keiths, the Hayes, the Murrays, the Randolphs, the Campbells, and others, who will fight tooth and nail to keep Bruce or one of his successors on the throne, because now, if anything happens to Bruce or his successors, the rewards those families have received, they go up in smoke. That's the legacy of Bannockburn, folks. The Scottish political community, who for the most part see Scottish independence as being vital, even if it is just for their continued prosperity. The process of creating that new community begins there. Cambus Kenneth Abbey in November 1314. Bruce, though, couldn't begin the process at Cambus Kenneth in November had he not beaten Edward down there at Bannockburn in June. That's the Battle of Bannockburn, folks. Do any of you have any questions about any of that? Bannockburn, when you look at that sort of like pop culture in Bannockburn, it's weird that it actually has never been in a film. Like technically at the very end of Braveheart they reference it, but you don't actually see it, and they don't do a very good job of showing you what Bannockburn is about. They show it as just like one big charge. And they say that, oh, it's the Scots have come to submit to the English, and they decide at the last minute not to, and so they just charge into them, and somehow that wins them the battle. So that's not a particularly accurate depiction of it. You then have, I mean, in the last sort of 10 years or so, we've had a couple of Robert Bruce movies. We had Outlaw King with Chris Pine, and then Robert the Bruce with Angus McFadden, who played him in Braveheart. Neither of them show what happened either. Outlaw King takes you up to 1307, May 1307, the Battle of Loudon Hill. Although it does make Loudon Hill a bit like Bannockburn, in that it puts Edward II there. Edward II isn't even king in May 1307. He's not present at Loudon Hill, even as the Prince of Wales, which he would have been at the time. And it shows you the English trying to get around the ditches that the Scots use at Loudon Hill. That doesn't happen either, but that's sort of what the English are trying to do here at Bannockburn. So yeah, it is always weird to me that we've apparently never been worthy enough to have a film made about us, because you could very easily, I think, make a movie that was just about Bannockburn in its kind of immediate context, because, you know, you get that deal made with Stirling Castle, Bruce has his month to train the troops, and then you have 2 days of actual fighting to run through, much of which is not just kind of action scene, people hacking lumps out of each other, but is manoeuvring and debates in the two armies about who should do what and where. There's lots of kind of interpersonal drama going on between the various war leaders on both sides, to be quite honest. But yeah, it's weird to me that we've never had a Bannockburn movie. In terms of your sort of Robert Bruce movies, obviously you have Braveheart, where he's quite a big character, Robert the Bruce, where he is the main character, and Outlaw King, where he's the main character again. And I would say of those 3, Outlaw King is probably the most accurate. But there's a lot of kind of romanticizing goes on. The key characteristic about Robert Bruce, the thing that helps make sense of all of his decisions, is his ambition. Robert Bruce is an incredibly, fiercely ambitious figure, and his ambition is, of course, to be king. All of the decisions that we see Robert making in the surviving sources are all best understood as being in pursuit of being king. And when they put him up on screen, he's always this kind of indecisive, naive figure who's, you know, he's never really sure of himself, and he has to be kind of convinced by the example of Wallace in Braveheart, or by seeing the sort of penury and sort of torment that the Scottish people go through in things like Outlaw King and Robert the Bruce, to finally sort of take up his mantle as king. And actually that's not what the real Robert was like at all. Robert always wanted to be king. And all of his dickering backwards and forwards between the Scottish side and the English side, and back to the English side and back on the Scottish side and so forth. All of that is driven by this ambition to be king. So me personally, I would really like to see that Robert Bruce put on screen. Robert Bruce, the anti-hero, the guy who you kind of follow along like you follow, I don't know, Michael Corleone in The Godfather or something, where he's a bit of a wrong'un or a bit of a scally, but you kind of you're on his side because he's the protagonist. I hope that kind of
that's great. Thanks.
Makes sense.
Where does the Battle of Falkirk fit in all of this?
Yeah, so that's depending on how you judge it, the second or third year of the war. So the war breaks out March 1296, and within months it looks like the English have completely conquered Scotland. They've occupied all of Scotland. John Balliol, the king, has surrendered himself. He's carted off down into England as a prisoner. The English, though, then, the administration, the sort of government that they enforce on Scotland is a very provocative form of government. Fundamentally, it's a very English form of government, which is not necessarily in and of itself too tyrannical, but it's certainly much more acquisitive. It demands much higher taxes. It demands a lot more sort of material contribution from its subjects than the Scots are used to. And so by spring 1297, sort of April, May time, you're seeing rebellions breaking out all over Scotland. In the south, led by William Wallace. In the north, led by a guy called Andrew Murray. In September 1297, Wallace and Murray bring their rebel armies together at the foot of the Abbey Craig, where the Wallace Monument is these days. An English army comes north to try and challenge them. The Scots let as many Englishmen as they think they can handle across Stirling Bridge. They then drive those Englishmen into that little loop in the river and pretty much wipe them out. There's one English knight who manages to fight his way out of that, we're told, a guy called Marmaduke Tweng, who, despite his very exotic sounding name, is actually from Yorkshire. He's still in the English army in 1314. Now that's the first Scottish victory of the war, and it proves to the Scots that resistance isn't futile, that they can fight the English and win with the right tactics in the right circumstances and so forth. On the basis of that victory, Wallace and Murray, who are relatively low-brow figures, Murray is a nobleman, but the son of a fairly minor baron. Wallace is not noble, he's a member of the gentry, so the kind of lower landowning class. But they have control of the army. They've just beat the English at Stirling Bridge. So they're made guardians. They're given basically kind of the power to serve as if they were kings without the title, obviously. Murray, though, is wounded, probably in the fighting at Stirling Bridge, and dies shortly afterwards, which leaves Wallace as the sole guardian. And then in the summer of 1298, so the next year, the summer after Stirling Bridge, Edward I himself, the English king, leads an army into Scotland. Now, it's not clear that Wallace is particularly desperate to fight him in the open. It may be that Wallace's instinct, like Bruce's, is to, be a guerrilla leader, stay out of the way, wear Edward down. But for uncertain reasons, possibly he feels that he has to show that Stirling Bridge wasn't a fluke. Possibly he's under a lot of pressure from the nobility. Remember, he's not a nobleman. And there's certainly later suggestions in sort of the Scottish Chronicle tradition that there's a lot of tension created by that. The nobles of Scotland don't really like taking orders from this kind of low-class figure, Wallace. Possibly he so he stays out of the way of the English for a while, and it's only as Edward is moving south again to cross the border that Wallace confronts him at Falkirk. So it may be that he thinks the guerrilla tactics have worked and that this is an English army that's now vulnerable to him. But for whatever reason he confronts them at Falkirk. He, unlike Bruce here at Bannockburn, where he anchors his flanks against streams so that all of his spearmen can face in the same direction and move, Wallace forms his spearmen up in oval-shaped formations so they can defend themselves from every angle, but only from attacks that come up close. The archers shoot them to bits at Falkirk after a failed cavalry charge. And then the cavalry charges back in and drives them off the field. And that basically breaks the back of Wallace's guardianship. Wallace probably resigns as guardian. There are some hints that he's basically muscled out. But whether or not he goes willingly, he does go. He's out of the guardianship, continues to resist the English right the way through until he's captured in 1305. So what's that? 7 years later. But it doesn't, crucially, Falkirk, break Scottish resistance. Because the Scots have seen that the English can be beaten, they do maintain a guardianship, a royal administration without a royal to lead it after Falkirk. So Falkirk is, the English wanted to be the be-all and end-all of, taking Scotland over again. But it doesn't quite work. What it does do is it boots Wallace back down the social ranks again, back to being a kind of minor figure. Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Got tied together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. Well, folks, unless we've got any desks from up there, or when we get you out here, folks, you can come back down here and have a closer look at the map. There's no issues with that. You can take photos from there. But yeah, I'll meet you out there, folks, and then we'll turn you loose.
Thank you.
Out here, folks, on the back wall, you'll find information about the sources. How do we know what we know about the battle? Behind the two screens, you'll find information about some of the people present. On the weapons rack, you'll find information about the arms and armour and the tactics used, and you can handle all of the arms and armour too. We will give you about 10-15 minutes or so to have a little explore out here. Then I'll bring you back together, folks, and I'll take you through to our final point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Remember we have a final thought here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the years after 1314, about the consequences of our back. So, just like to step this way with me. Look at that. If you lift up, you want to feel the weight of them. Have a month training with it, remember down the forward and then you'd be out in the battlefield.
And this is under the army,
These here obviously see the big yellow screen. That's crucial. Great. So this film is going to tell you a little bit about the years after 1314. I'll start the film and then duck out through the door at the back there, but I will come back and collect you when the film is done. The film's going to last about 6 minutes, and with one last thing to tell you before the tour is done.
The Chiltern lines pushed forward, and Edward's army had no room to manoeuvre. The crush became so bad that Edward's army fled across the bannockburn. The burn was steep, and many died trying to make it across, so many that, after a while, the burn could be crossed with dry feet. A shocked King Edward had to be dragged by his horse's reins from the field. Edward fled to Stirling Castle, but was denied entry. He was chased east to Dunbar, where he escaped by ship to England. Edward's baggage train, now undefended, was plundered by the victorious, allowing more survivors to flee the field. With thousands lying dead on the battlefield, there was valuable armour and weaponry to collect. The encampments were dismantled, leaving very little trace. Many English knights were captured and their lives spared for ransom. An exchange of prisoners ensured the release of Elizabeth, who was being held captive. She was brought to York for her release. Following the great victory, the Scots took the war to the English. 4 years later, Edward's queen, Isabella, was repeatedly nearly captured in the same city during a raid far across the border by the victorious forces, who had found a new confidence in striking out across northern England and also at English supporters in Ireland. All of which was an attempt to pressure Edward into negotiating with them. There were some who never forgot how the king took the throne. The Pope had excommunicated Scotland in an attempt to stop the fighting, and this needed to be addressed. 50 Scottish nobles gave their support to a letter declaring Scotland as an independent nation and one that should be recognised by the Pope. All the while, some of them were plotting to kill the king and put John Balliol's son, Edward Balliol, in his place. Still, the traitors were severely dealt with, and eventually France and the Pope recognised the king. In contrast, south of the border, in 1321, Edward faced rebellion. His barons were angered by his new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, who masterminded the king's triumph over his rebellious cousin, the Earl of Lancaster. The new regime was unpopular, tyrannical and corrupt, all of which served to take Edward's attention away from Scotland. In 1324, the future of Scotland became more clear because of the birth of twin sons to the king. David was born and lived, the next generation of Scottish royalty. England's monarchy was in trouble. Edward once again thought he could do exactly as he pleased. Queen Isabella abandoned her husband and with a lover, Roger Mortimer, began to plot his downfall. And so her son, Edward III, came to the throne, while her husband died a mysterious death. In 1328, Queen Elizabeth of Scotland died. I, Robert Bruce, am now very old and very ill. But today, a treaty was sealed at Edinburgh, which sees it agreed that Scotland is an independent nation, although there can never be any guarantee that this war will end for good. My son, David, will rule Scotland.
Scots in 1329. That's not even a scary fact. The scary fact is he's been married for a year by that point as well. Wow. Now, folks, that is about it for us in here. The door is going to let you out into our cafe. To your right, you will see some scenes from the battle depicted in Lego, which I think is a particular highlight. You'll also see some doors that ordinarily would I'll go that one. We're getting close, folks, I promise.
Hey, thanks a lot. Sorry.
Try it out.